Viewpoints, Critical Philosophy, a personal perspective with Herbert Marcuse, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of California at San Diego. Your Viewpoints host is Helen Hawkins.
Herbert Marcuse is one of the best known and one of the most controversial of contemporary philosophers. Born and educated in Germany, Marcuse came to the United States in 1934 and became an American citizen in 1940. The most widely read of his several books are Eros and Civilization, A Philosophical Inquiry into Freud, and One-Dimensional Man, which made him the intellectual idol of New Left militants in the late 60s. Dr. Marcuse, what do you consider the primary function of philosophy?
Well, this is supposed to be a personal statement. For me, philosophy is critical philosophy. And the concern of critical philosophy is the human condition. It seems that human beings, men and women, have had a rather frustrating, hard and harsh and repressive life throughout history. This, it seems, has not improved at all with technical progress. Now, critical philosophy tries to find out what are the reasons for this condition, and even more important, what are the real possibilities of building a society in which this would no longer be the case.
In the preface to your Reason and Revolution, Hegel and the Rise of Social Theory in 1941, you said that you hoped to revive the power of negative thinking. Is that what you mean by critical philosophy?
That's one aspect of it. Negative thinking in the sense that not everything is accepted at face value, that conformity can be a very repressive attitude, and that negative thinking in the form of a critique, of a real critique of existing conditions, is in itself a progressive force, or can be a progressive force.
So do you see the role of the philosopher as an agent of historical change?
Exactly. And that is one of the things in which, well, this is a personal statement, because I would say that the majority of my colleagues would not agree with it.
Have you then been criticized for this position?
I've been plenty criticized for this position, but I don't mind that.
Now, you identify yourself as a Marxist, but we hear the word
Yes.
Marxist used for a wide variety of positions. What does Marxist mean to you, as you
Well, let me
practice it?
first say that I never denied that I'm a Marxist. I don't deny it today, although, as you just mentioned, if I look around and see what calls itself Marxist today, I would rather not use the term. For example, every more or less despotic left-wing regime in the world is called a Marxist regime. There's no connection between the two. What I mean by Marxist is somebody who still takes Marx's idea of a socialist society as a free and democratic society seriously. And that is what I'm trying to do, and to find out whether there are any tendencies which point in this direction today.
Now, it would appear from what I have read of your work and the comments that I've seen on it that the kind of social change your critical philosophy would lead toward might involve the necessity for revolution. For you, what kind of a revolution does that mean? Is it a revolution in the sense of violent upheaval, or gradual change, or what?
Well, we cannot, if we look at history, we cannot find any example of a non-violent revolution, including the American Revolution. So we cannot expect that this continuity of violence would suddenly stop. although Marx himself has foreseen the possibility of a peaceful transition to socialism, and he has even mentioned in this connection the United States as one of the countries where by democratic vote socialism could gain a majority. I must say frankly that today it seems to me the chances for such a non-violent revolution are worse than they were before.
Do I read you correctly, though, that then a philosopher or philosophy should encourage revolution?
A philosopher, and especially a philosopher working at the university, should not encourage and should not advocate. If he or she presents the facts as they are, and the tendencies which are observable in our society, then the students will by themselves get the idea that a good change is necessary and is possible.
I'd like to return to what might be the ultimate implications of that position a little later, but first what I'd like to do is to look at some of your work. Mm-hmm. The first book that really caught the attention of people outside of academia was Eros and Civilization in 1955, and it does seem that that book suggests many of the ideas that you later elaborated in future work. You've called that an extrapolation of Freud.
Because I use hypotheses of Freud's going beyond them. In other words, what I say and state in Freudian terms is not necessarily that which Freud himself would have used and approved of.
What you've essentially done in that book is to challenge Freud's own suggestion in Civilization and its discontents that repression is a necessary part of any civilization.
Well, I think you are going a little too far.
Am I?
Yes, definitely, because it is true that I think neither I nor anyone else can imagine a civilization without repression. I make the distinction between repression and what I call surplus repression. That is to say, in the course of civilization, many taboos, many restrictions have been imposed which are actually not necessary anymore in terms of the possible development of human beings. So I certainly would not say that civilization can be without any repression.
But you would say that the degree of repression
The degree of repression is decisive.
And do you lay that to technological changes that make this kind of repression no longer as necessary?
No, I wouldn't say that the repression today is no longer necessary. It's still, a surplus repression is no longer necessary. That is to say, repression that goes beyond the basic taboos and the basic prohibitions any and every civilization depends on.
Now, you use the term eros in that book to signify more than the ordinary person, I think.
Yes, I think I use the term in agreement with Freud in a much wider sense. Eros is not identical with sexuality. Sexuality, according to Freud, is a partial and local drive, whereas Eros actually activates the entire human organism and the entire human personality. He identified Eros with the life instincts, and I think that is a very good explanation. Understandable, however, only if we add the other primary drive of Freud, the destruction instinct or death instinct. So you would have in the human organism two primary drives: erotic energy, life instincts, and destructive energy, death instinct. Now, I still use Freud's terminology because it seems to me that our present society is characterized by a considerable strengthening of the destruction and death instincts over and above ours and the life instincts.
But
That is my general
And
sketch.
you suggest that by focusing on the...
By strengthening the life instincts, change to the better could be achieved.
Now, that book has been criticized, as has all of your work, on several grounds. One, that it does distort Freud, some would say. But of course, I guess any hypotheses can be interpreted by others as they will. But another suggestion has been made, or criticism has been made, that you do a lot of asserting without supporting arguments or evidence. How do you respond to those?
Can you give an example of that?
Well,
it may well be that I say many things that cannot be proven in the sense of a scientific proof as we understand it today. But I use hypotheses. And I think I do illustrate and fortify the hypothesis by pointing to facts.
I think one of the contexts of that kind of criticism was that your type of philosophy could be considered to be in opposition to the, quote, scientific or Comtean, or what are some of the other terms for that, where the only thing that can be accepted as real is that which is demonstrable through scientific evidence.
Well, I would accept demonstrable, I would reject according to scientific evidence, because then we would use a concept of proof and evidence which is valid only for the natural sciences, physics, biology, whatever it is, but cannot be simply applied to the humanities and social sciences.
Another comment that's made about that book is that it is very optimistic, and in fact possibly too optimistic in terms of its view of human nature, if I could use that term's potential. Do you feel that it is an overly optimistic view?
I desperately try to maintain my optimism even today. I actually want to be pessimistic, and I think there's much justification for it. But if I look around, there are still so many things which are good and which are positive, and there are still quite a few tendencies that make and indicate a change to the better, that I'm rather optimistic.
Well, now, your 1964 book that is really the most widely read, One-Dimensional Man.
Yes, unfortunately, I think the
very
Freud book is much better.
You say that
the Freud book is much better.
Yet in that One-Dimensional Man book, you severely indicted modern industrial society and the kind of person that has resulted from it.
Well, I would say not I indicted, it indicts itself.
Is the kind of attitude that was reflected in that book a reflection of the times, and have you changed your ideas that you expressed in that book at all since then?
It is a reflection of the times. I have changed my ideas somehow after 1968-69. Because I see in these years the emergence of a new and potentially rather promising and powerful opposition against the destructive tendencies in our society today.
Now, in One-Dimensional Man, you essentially said, if I am not misinterpreting you, that modern man in industrial society is so much the captive, as it were, of his own technological affluence,
which he cannot control,
that he has become part of the system, and that the working class, which was so long expected to be the locus of change or revolution, is now co-opted into the system. And the indictment you made of things like television and other kinds of public media as ways of controlling society were very sharp. Do you still feel that there is that much of a sense of capture of the people by the system?
Well, it certainly isn't any lighter than it was before. The degree of control, especially after the use of computers and so on, has been intensified rather than weakened. But what for me is the optimistic sign is that in the opposition of 68, 69, it was demonstrated that a, not escape, that a coming out of, that a breaking with the universal controls is possible. Possible at that time still in small groups, collectives, communes, whatever there is, but the serious attempt to try relationships between human beings which are not in a repressive sense controlled from above or from outside.
You didn't see that what is considered to be the failure of the French student revolution, as it were, in 1968 as a setback then?
It may be a temporary setback. I would not say, as practically everyone says, let's apply it to this country, that the student movement was defeated, that it doesn't exist anymore. It has changed its form, it still exists. And what is to me the most important thing, some of the values proclaimed by the student movement have actually penetrated the society as a whole and are diffused among the population as a whole. For example, let me give you one example, otherwise it's too abstract. The almost general awareness that one does not have to work 8 hours a day, plus the hours required for transportation, in an inhuman and routine and mechanized way, that one can live much easier without giving up most of the achievements of culture and so on. This is one of the achievements of the student movement, and this can be demonstrated, by the way.
Now, you did say in One Dimensional Man that the missing dimension was the dimension of critical awareness of negative thinking.
Yes.
Now, have you then decided that since then that awareness has developed?
One Dimensional Man came out in 64, and the student movement 68, 69.
Now, I think probably the most controversial of your work is what you said in the essay Repressive Tolerance.
I know.
In which you suggested that liberal toleration of other views was illusory, that the only views that are tolerated, in fact, are the status quo type views, and that what dissent is tolerated is only tolerated so far as it has no effect. And you suggested that there really ought to be some sort of suppression of the kinds of what you called destructive views, destructive of life.
I'm afraid I still think so. And let me give you an example. I believe that if the Weimar Republic in Germany would not have tolerated the Hitler movement to the very end, 1933, we may well have been spared a world war and the extermination of 6 million Jews.
Of course, the major question that's raised about that
that's right. What kind of
who decides which and when ideas should be suppressed?
I would say every halfway intellectual normal being. In, for example, reading what Hitler constantly said and constantly published, would know that this is a deadly destructive movement. He doesn't need any philosophical or scientific proof for it.
Well, we can see that looking back at it, but in the context of today, who is going to make the decisions as to what kinds of dangerous ideas should be suppressed? Do you count on the democratic process to do that?
To tell you the truth, yes. Who decides today what is to be repressed and what is not to be repressed? Who decides today? Again, I would say, if what I said in repressive tolerance makes any sense, it presupposes a really democratic society in which the people themselves can be shown and can see what is destructive and what is not.
That sounds almost unachievable.
That is certainly for the time being utopian. And I would like to say one thing very clearly. In the present situation in this country, I would certainly defend to the very last the civil liberties and civil rights, because that is the only counterforce against the intensified control and repression.
So that what that really means then is that your suggestion that some ideas are so destructive that they must be repressed couldn't happen.
I wouldn't say it couldn't happen. I wouldn't say that. But it is at present in this country not acute.
Now, you did say that in recent years you've seen an emergence of the kind of new sensibility
Yes.
that some of your later work suggested was really needed, that there would be a whole new kind of man or person
Exactly.
developing.
Yes.
Is that something that you see as happening only in Western civilization, or do you see it in other parts of the world as well?
I would say you do see it in other parts of the world too, perhaps in some of the liberation movements in the Third World, for example, but essentially it is confined so far to the advanced industrial countries in the West.
And your critical philosophy has in fact been directed primarily to analyzing that society.
Definitely, because that is the society I know and that I can do.
Now, you said in your 1972 book, Counter-Revolution and Revolt, that the counter-revolution was in the ascendant, and that the route to change really was through theory, through education, through persuasion. Do you then see the role of the universities, the colleges, as very strong in the change process?
They could have a very decisive effect. But unfortunately, as you know, there's a tendency to transform the universities in professional schools at the expense of such disciplines as humanities and social sciences, which is a very dangerous tendency because it actually stifles any criticism that goes beyond a very well-set framework.
Do you feel that the major centers of critical thought are in the universities today?
I would say some of them are still in the universities, quite a few, and probably the majority outside. In the manifestations of what is still called the New Left.
Speaking of the New Left, at the time that One-Dimensional Man was picked up by the student militants particularly, there were a lot of New Left people, or people who were identified by that term, who were very much supportive of your ideas. Are you still considered one of the leading lights in that framework, or have they gone beyond you or in different directions?
They have gone beyond me, they have gone below me, and I never considered myself as the idol or as the father or grandfather of the New Left. What happened was a coincidence of ideas and opinions. The students didn't have to read One-Dimensional Man in order to protest, in order to rebel. So I still consider myself very much sympathetic and part of whatever is left of this movement.
Now, the students of that era, you say, didn't have to read the book, primarily because they were experiencing what you were describing.
They were experiencing in their own body and mind what motivated them to rebel.
Do you think they, when they did read your book, understood your work?
That I don't know.
Because that is one major question that's raised about your writings, that they are very difficult to understand, even by people who have a background in the philosophical framework that you use.
I know, and I regret it deeply. I try to write clearer. On the other hand, I take comfort from the fact that quite a few people do and did understand it.
The question I'd like to get back to in the very short time we have left is that if one argues for change, and if that change will require revolution, and if revolution is unlikely to come about without violence, does not that then give validation to violence, which in turn may perhaps validate terrorism?
Advocacy of violence is, under all circumstances, in our situation, should be taboo. Violence may be considered justified only as counter-violence. In the sentence in repressive tolerance, I explicitly said that there is a so-called right of resistance, a natural right of resistance, for suppressed minorities after all legal means have been exhausted. I also added that if then these minorities rebel, that might break the chain of violence which we had throughout history. I am a little less optimistic respectively this topic. I would say the breaking of the chain of violence is probably only thinkable in a long historical process, but not that quickly.
Well, Dr. Marcuse, I know many Americans will disagree with some of your ideas, if not all of them. And yet, I'm sure we can all benefit from considering the questions you ask about our society and the goals we should seek. Thank you very much for clarifying your views for us. And thank you very much for joining us. Good night.